Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read The Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, and the redness and horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and the profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet strains of the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out of the aid and from the sympathy of the fellow men. The whole seizure progress and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the prince Prospero, and happy and dauntless and sagacious, when his dominions were half depopulated and summoned to the presence of 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of the court, which these retired to the deep seclusion of one of the calustrated abbeys. These were extensive and magnificent structure and creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. The strong and lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers had entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and wielded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither the ingress or egress to the sudden impulse of despair of its frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned, but such precautions and courtiers might bid defiance to conjugal. The external world would take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the 5th of the 6th of the month of their seclusion, and while the pestilence raged from most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell you of the room in which it was held. There were 7 an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different. It might have been expected from the Duke's lover of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than once at a time. There was a sharp turn of every 20 or 30 yards, and each turn a different effect. To the right and to the left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon the closed corridor which pursued the windows of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue. The vividly blue were at windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green and throughout, and there were casements. The fourth was furnished lighted with orange, the fifth with white, and the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of the 7 apartments were there any lamps or candelabrum, and upon the profusion of golden ornaments there lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanated from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearer of brazier of fire that projected its rays throughout the tinted glass, so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. In the western and blank chamber the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look from the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within the precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that they stood against the western wall, a gigantic clock of ebony. The pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and then the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken. There came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was so clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so particular a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were considered to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert in the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and the sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, the light laughter had once pervaded the assembly, the musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly had made whispering vows each to each other that the next chiming of the clock could produce in them no similar motion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, was embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, and yet another chiming of the clock, and then there was the same disconcerted and tremulous meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were particular. He had a fine eye of colors and effects that disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was in his own guiding taste that he had given character to the masqueraders. But sure, they were grotesque. They were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what had been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures and unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fantasies, such as the madmen fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and a little of that might have been excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers were stocked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, ride in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes of the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still and all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro, and merrier than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which the streams the rays from the tripods to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven. There are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows of ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock an ebony of muffled peal, more solemnly empathetic than any of the reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were close, densely crowded, and then beat fervorously the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on until at length these consume and sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted. There was an uneasy sensation of all things as before. And now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened perhaps that more of the thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened perhaps that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, and there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of the masked figure, who had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of the new presence had spread itself whisperingly around. There arose in length from the whole company of buzz or murmur, expressingly a disapprobation and surprise, when finally of terror and horror and of disgust, and an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted. It may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. The truth of the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod and gone beyond the bounds of even the prime's indefinite decorum. And there are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, in whom life and death are equally jests, and are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company indeed seemed to be deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of the stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny had much difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not been approved by the mad revelers around. But the murmurs had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, his broad brow and all the features of his face was besprinkled in the scarlet horror. Then the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon the special image, which with slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain his role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers. And he had seemed to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. Who dares, he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers to seize near him, who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, and we may know him. We have to hang at sunrise from the battlements. It was in this eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince of the bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince and a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at that moment had also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. And from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party, there were found none but forthhand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within the yard of the prince's person, and while the yard assembly, as if the one impulse shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, has made his way uninterruptedly, but within the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, from this again to the white, and then hence to the violet. Harry decided movement had been made to arrest him, and then was, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and shame of his own monetary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that seized upon all, and borne aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity, and within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterward fell prostrate in death of Prince Prospero. The summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and ceasing the murmur, which tall figures stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, grasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untended by any tangible form, and now with acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out, and that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and the darkness and decay of the Red Death held inimitable dominion over all. That's the last of the Masque of the Red Death. If there's any like and enjoyment here, please like and subscribe, and have a nice day.